And the UN Security Council is holding an emergency meeting over the United States' actions in Venezuela. The council saying that the crisis risks creating regional instability, and it has warned of a dangerous precedent. Venezuela and its allies are accusing the U.S. of violating the UN Charter, which enshrines the sovereignty of nation states, as well as prohibiting the use of force in international relations. And our coverage continues now with Christopher Sabatini. He's a senior research fellow for Latin America, U.S. and the Americas program at Chatham House. Christopher, it's good to have you with us. Let me ask you about this, this emergency session of the UN Security Council. Is there any legal justification that you can point to that would have allowed President Trump's actions in Venezuela?
No, not at all. The U.S. officials that are in favor of this intervention like to claim that that Nicolas Maduro had been indicted in a U.S. court, and they use that as justification. But of course, it's a dangerous precedent, as you said, in which the UN Security Council is discussing right now, that any country could indict any president, any head of state, any minister, any public official, and then use that as justification to go in and seize that person. It's a very dangerous precedent. There was no, first of all, it's in violation quite probably of the U.S. Constitution. There's no War Powers Act that accompanied this. But also in terms of the use of force, there was no warning to the UN. There is no actual act to consult with the UN. This, quite frankly, is in violation of international law, pure and simple.
Well, we've heard from President Trump. We've also heard from the Secretary of State that this was more of a police action that we saw late Friday, early Saturday. Is this a case, in your opinion, where the U.S. is saying that the end here justifies the means?
Quite frankly, the police action doesn't justify it. I mean, they're trying to downplay it as being a military action, but it was a military action. It was the U.S. Navy, Special Ops Forces that did this. This isn't a law enforcement operation. No country can go into another country and enforce its own laws in that country. That's not to say that Nicolas Maduro is innocent, or Celia Flores, or any of the others that are in the government. Some of them still there, Diosdado Cabello, Pedro Lopez among them, the Interior Minister and Defense Minister, respectively. But to say it's a legal operation, law enforcement operation, is simply belying the facts that the U.S. military swept in. It bombed 120 some planes, went over. They bombed a number of key sites, and then they landed in a military fort and seized the president. That's not a law enforcement operation.
What about the interim leader now of Venezuela? I'm talking about Delcy Rodriguez. President Trump says he expects to be working with her. Is she likely, do you think, to play ball, or do you think she has her own agenda?
That's a tough call. She has been really, in many ways, the international public face of this government beyond Nicolas Maduro. She's been trained in France and the UK. She and her brother is president of the National Assembly, have really been the dominant civilians in this government, second to Nicolas Maduro. She has also been the person who's negotiated with Venezuelan debt bondholders, as well as oil companies. She's seen as being a technocrat, as a pragmatist. She has actually the only team of economists in the entire government. But whether she can reconcile the demands of the Trump administration to lead to some form of transition, to curtail the criminal operations that the Trump administration has correctly pointed out Venezuelan government is involved in, and while still maintaining a base of support within the government, because there is a rivalry within the government. Diosdado Cabello, the Interior Minister, Pedro Lopez, the Defense Minister, have always been at dagger's draw with the civilian elements, especially Delcy Rodriguez and her brother Jorge. So she's got to sort of tiptoe around them, engage quite likely in some law enforcement operations that will reduce the flow of illegal drugs, which aren't significant, but still they do occur to the United States and other illicit activities, while not offending, if you will, sort of the security apparatus of the country that's been left entirely intact after the Trump removal of Nicolas Maduro.
Yeah, let me pick up with that. You know, just a day after Maduro was captured, President Trump lashed out at another Latin American president. I'm thinking about the president of Colombia, Gustavo Petro. What is your assessment here? Was Maduro's capture, was it just the beginning?
It was more than just Venezuela. This was a shot across the bow to many countries around the region. It was in an effort to say, look, there's a new sheriff in town named Donald Trump. He is going to guard and protect what he perceives to be the U.S. sphere of influence, the Western Hemisphere, against threats to national interest. And in this particular case, he made the case that it was narcotics, illicit activities. Obviously, it wasn't about democracy because he didn't back the Democratic government opposition in its accession to power on Saturday. But yes, he's also now looking at Colombia, Cuba, Mexico. All of those are major, well, at least Mexico and Colombia are major narcotics producing and exporting countries. Fentanyl in the case of Venezuela, in the case of Mexico, some cocaine, cocaine obviously in Colombia. What he's saying is, look, if you don't abide by my demands to curtail the flow of drugs and immigrants, I'm willing to use the military force to either take out key sites or even in some cases take out the leaders. And that's what we also saw in that, quite frankly, ridiculous tweet by Stephen Miller's wife of the map of the flag of the United States superimposed on Greenland. In that case, U.S. isn't about to invade Greenland, isn't about to offend a European ally, but these are maximalist demands, and the use of the military force just this last weekend, in the case of Maduro, demonstrates that Trump is willing to use it. He may be using it only as a bargaining chip to get what he wants, but he's trying to send the signal, this is the new sheriff in town, you better listen to what we want.
Christopher Sabatini with the latest tonight from Chatham House. As always, Christopher, we appreciate your time and your insights.
Thanks a lot, Brett.
All right, I want to bring in now Janina Dill. She's the director of the Oxford Institute for Ethics, Law and Armed Conflict. She joins us now from Oxford, England. It's good to have you with us this evening. This U.S. military operation may have broken international law, yet Maduro is facing charges in a U.S. court today. The U.S. has given their legal justifications. Do you consider those arguments? Are they valid?
There is almost no doubt possible that U.S. actions in Venezuela violated international law. The United States conducted large-scale military operations without the consent of Venezuela. This is, as a matter of fact, the United States thereby started an international armed conflict with Venezuela in violation of the prohibition on the use of force, one of the most fundamental rules in the international legal system. None of the usual exceptions to that prohibition, like self-defense or a Security Council mandate, are available here. So this is simply an illegal act of aggression, and recharacterizing it as a law enforcement operation doesn't change that as a matter of law.
And so what happens next? Have we seen a troubling precedent now set?
So not every time a country violates international law does it thereby set a precedent for that violation to potentially become lawful conduct. We have had a lot of commentators invoke the 1989 invasion of Panama and capture of General Noriega as supposedly a precedent for this. But that argument falls short precisely because of how states at the time reacted to it. They by and large condemned the invasion, and there was at least no consistent support for the capture of Noriega. And by the same token, it is quite important for how states react to this now. If they by and large condemn this as an illegal aggression or invasion, and at least protest or question the removal of head of state immunity from Maduro, then the law as such stands largely unaffected. So in the first instance, this is a violation of law, not a precedent for new law.
And let's say we've seen a lot of criticism today of what the United States did in Venezuela. But at the end of the day, does it really matter? I mean, will there be real repercussions for the U.S.?
Well, we have seen some quite weak reactions as well from quarters of the international system where you would think we should see a strong condemnation. For instance, the statement of the European Union invoked international law quite substantively and passionately, but clearly sidestepped actually calling out the United States for violating international law. And the statements, for instance, of the United Kingdom and Germany in response to this have been exceptionally weak, in a sense, trying to really avoid having to say that the United States violated international law. And that is obviously very dangerous for international law because it can weaken these rules that prohibit invading a country because it has strategically important energy reserves, or removing the head of state immunity from a head of state that is clearly illegitimate, but still in virtue of that role is supposed to be immune from prosecution. So these rules are at stake here. There is a lot at stake in terms of weakening international law. And for that reason alone, I think the reaction of the international community could have been stronger.
And I know that you also specialize in ethics, and the force of law has a lot to do with those enforcers finding that piece of legislation or that law to be in line with their ethical, their moral compass. With that in mind, what do you think the actions we've seen in Venezuela, what are they going to do to the ethics of international law moving forward?
So in the first instance, weakening international law is ethically problematic, right? From the perspective of every single state in the international system that on its own would not be able to stand up to the United States militarily, that state has a strong ethical and strategic reason in upholding and strengthening the prohibitions on the use of force, so prohibiting invasion, and the prohibition on simply capturing a sitting head of state, even an illegitimate one. So weakening international law is morally problematic. But if we put that aside for a minute and ask, is it actually ethical to capture Noriega and try to effect regime change here in Venezuela, right? Then in the first instance, we would of course say that Maduro, not Noriega. Maduro is, in virtue of his own conduct, liable to detention and capture. He posed an unjustified threat to scores of Venezuelans. But then the second question is, what are the likely consequences of his removal from power in this way? Will this actually improve the situation for human rights, for democracy in Venezuela on the ground? And at that point, it actually starts to matter whether the US sort of supposed rationale for its invasion of democratizing Venezuela, of potentially helping liberate the people of Venezuela, whether that is just a pretext or whether it was a sincerely pursued objective. And in the past, we have seen in the past 2 days quite a lot to suggest that unfortunately it's pretext, because the United States hasn't taken steps to now help democratize Venezuela, to improve the human rights situations on the ground. And if the balance of consequences of the capture and removal of Noriega, of that regime change, is in the way that we have seen regime changes in other contexts pan out, then I would say, even from an ethical point of view and understanding the democratic legitimacy deficit and the threat Maduro posed to others, even from the ethical perspective, this was unjustified.
Janina Dill from the Oxford Institute for Ethics, Law, and Armed Conflict. We appreciate your time and your valuable insights tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.